Some men build walls so well they forget there's a door. He had been standing still for 3 years.
Then something arrived that stillness could not stop. She did not look like a woman who had come to be saved.
And she looked at him the way no one had looked at him in 3 years.
Wyoming Territory, September 1883. The iron had been heating since before the sun cleared the ridge, and by the time the yard filled with men, it glowed the color of something that had stopped being metal and started being intention. 62 men stood along the corral fence at Doss Hollow, and not one of them looked away from the woman kneeling at its center. Ren Callaway did not kneel because her legs had failed her. She knelt because Harlan Doss had placed his hand on her shoulder 6 years ago and never fully removed it, and the weight of that hand had become, over time, a grammar she had learned to read the way other women learned scripture. His fingers on her shoulder now were a sentence she already knew the ending of. Her wrists were bound in front of her with a leather strap, looped twice and cinched by a ranch hand named Odell Grant, who had not met her eyes while he did it. The braid in her hair had come loose on one side. Dark strands stuck to her jaw where the morning sweat had pasted them. She kept her spine straight. That was the only inheritance she still held. A spine that would not curve, just because everything around it had learned to expect the curve. Harlan Doss crouched to her eye level, the way a man crouches when he wants the intimacy of small distance without the vulnerability of being seen to need it. He was a big man made careful by years of practicing smallness in public, the specific smallness of a man who understood that authority whispered carried further than authority shouted. 6 years, he said, quiet enough that only she heard it first. And you still haven't learned that debts in this territory get paid the way I say they get paid. I've paid it 100 times over, Ren said, and her voice did not shake, though the leather strap had left marks on her wrists that would still be visible a week from now. You just keep changing the number. His hand tightened on her shoulder, not a violent grip, the grip of a man reminding a door that it is a door. Then he stood and raised his voice so the fence line could hear. 62 witnesses, he said, that the debt gets paid the way debts get paid out here, and that marked women don't run. At the edge of the crowd, Sheriff Aldous Whitmore sat his horse and said nothing. He had ridden out that morning at Doss's personal invitation to lend the proceedings the appearance of lawful oversight they did not deserve. He had accepted that invitation, as he had accepted every other small favor Harlan Doss had extended over 15 years of careful, patient cultivation, because refusing had long since become more expensive than complying, and because a man who tells himself often enough that he is simply keeping the peace eventually stops being able to hear the difference between peace and silence. Ren noticed him noticing nothing. She noticed everything now, the way a woman learns to notice the exits of every room she has ever been locked into, the 2 ranch hands nearest the fire pit. The younger man tending the iron, barely 19, whose face had not yet hardened enough to hide what he was feeling and who had glanced at her twice already and looked away both times, ashamed of a thing he had no power to stop. The gap in the fence line at the northwest corner where 3 men had spread apart to watch rather than stand close, which meant that gap was the widest opening in the ring. She had been cataloging exits since she was 14 years old. It had become as natural as breathing and nearly as involuntary. The young man tending the iron lifted it slightly from the coals, checking the color. Not yet. A few minutes more. Ren Callaway had been Callaway for 6 years, though no blood connected her to the name, no marriage, no legal claim of any kind beyond a signature her uncle had scratched onto a ledger the week he decided that a 14-year-old girl's labor was worth considerably more to him as collateral than as a niece to be raised properly. Her uncle's name had been Edmund, and he had owed Harlan Doss money on a failed cattle venture, and the debt had a number that Edmund could not reach, and so one afternoon in the spring of 1877 he had reached for something else instead. He had signed her name alongside his own on a document that described her as indentured labor against the outstanding balance, and he had shaken Doss's hand across the table, and that had been the end of one life and the beginning of another. Doss had always been careful to say that he had bought the debt, not the girl. He repeated this distinction regularly, as though the words themselves constituted a kind of moral hygiene that cleansed the arrangement of whatever it actually was. The debt had a face now. The debt had hands that scrubbed his floors and salted his meat and mended his shirts and rose before dawn every morning to haul wash water from the well. The debt had a spine that would not bend. For 6 years she had told herself that a debt being a number meant it could eventually reach 0. She had believed this the way people believe things that allow them to keep breathing. Not because it was true, but because the alternative to believing it was a darkness she could not afford to look at directly and still function. Then, 3 months ago, she had found the study ledger unlocked for 11 minutes while Doss argued with a cattle buyer in the yard, and she had read enough of the numbers to understand that debts like hers were never designed to reach 0. They were designed to be renewed. Each year, new charges appeared, new deductions. Food and lodging and incidentals calculated at rates that ensured the principal never shrank fast enough to matter. A debt that renewed itself annually was not a debt at all. It was a cage with a number written on the door to make the door look like a temporary inconvenience rather than a permanent wall. The brand was the next step. She understood this clearly, standing in that study with 11 minutes of stolen knowledge burning in her chest. Marked women were recognized in every town within 200 miles and returned, and the return always cost the woman more than the running had. She had watched it happen to Della Pruitt. Della had been 4 years older than Ren, and sharper in every way that required quickness rather than patience. She had a tongue that cut like good steel, and a laugh that she deployed like a weapon, precisely and economically, in the moments when it would do the most to sustain the morale of whoever was standing nearest to her. She had taught Ren to fold pie dough, and more usefully, to fold her own expression into something unreadable whenever Doss walked into a room. She had taught Ren the difference between silence that protected you and silence that agreed with the man doing the harm, and that the first kind was survival and the second kind was a slow erosion of something you could not get back. 8 months ago, Della had run. She had made it 11 miles before Doss's men found her. The story that came back to the ranch afterward, delivered by Odell Grant in the flat voice of a man reciting words he had been given rather than words he believed, was that she had fallen from a horse she had stolen, out past the ridgeline, alone, unlucky. A regrettable accident. Ren had served supper that evening without saying a single word. She had hated herself for the silence every day since. The iron came out of the coals again, orange and humming with a faint dry heat that Ren could feel from 6 feet away. Not the temperature of it, the intention of it. Doss turned to signal the man holding it. That was when the horse came through the tree line at the northern edge of the yard, and every man along the fence turned to look. Elias Crow rode the way a man rides when he has already counted every gun in the yard and found the number manageable, not at a gallop. A gallop was for men who needed the arrival to look dramatic. He came in at a walk, letting the sound of hooves on packed September dirt do the announcing for him, letting 62 men turn their heads one by one, like a slow wave running the length of the fence, until the only person in that entire yard who had not turned to look was Ren herself. She had learned a long time ago not to turn toward the sound of hoofbeats. Hope was expensive, and she had stopped spending on it. He stopped his horse 8 feet from the nearest man in the ring, dismounted without hurry, the way a man dismounts when he has decided the ground is worth standing on. His coat was the color of rain clouds before they commit to anything. He had a scar along his right forearm where a bullet had opened him years ago and closed badly, and eyes that did not widen at the sight of a heated iron or a bound woman, because he had seen both before in a yard not entirely unlike this one, 4 years ago, and one person too late. He let the silence run for exactly 3 seconds after his boots hit the ground, long enough for every man present to finish his calculation about what kind of man this was. Then he spoke, and his voice had the particular quality of a man who has no interest in being heard by everyone but simply is, because the voice itself carries the weight of someone who has already decided how the next few minutes will go. That brand isn't going anywhere near her. Doss did not remove his hand from Ren's shoulder. "This is a private matter of debt, mister," he said. "Settled according to the custom of this territory, witnessed by proper parties. You'd best ride back the way you came." "I heard the number you're burning into her skin," Elias said. "It's not a debt number. It's a property number. There's a difference, and every man standing at this fence knows it. Even the ones who have spent the last hour pretending they don't." Something moved through the crowd at that. Not a sound, exactly. More like a collective adjustment of posture, the particular physical response of men who have just heard something said aloud that they had individually decided not to say, and who are now recalculating what it cost them to continue that silence publicly. 3 men near the northwest gap had gone very still. One of them, older, with the weather-beaten deliberateness of a man who has attended too many events he later wished he hadn't, had already begun easing his horse toward the tree line, slowly enough that it might look accidental. Ren looked up then, not at Elias, at the crowd, at the particular stillness spreading through it, the way stillness spreads when men begin wondering which version of the story they want to be in when it gets told at supper. "Odell," Doss said without turning from Elias. His voice had dropped to the flat register he used when he was giving instructions he expected to be followed immediately. "If this man isn't off my land in the next 10 seconds, Elias drew before the sentence finished. Not fast, in the theatrical sense. Not the draw of a man performing speed for an audience. The draw of a man for whom the motion was so thoroughly practiced that it had stopped being a decision and become simply the next thing that happened. The way breathing is the next thing that happens. The barrel came level and rested low, aimed at nothing more specific than the space between the iron and the fire it had come from. "The brand goes back in the coals," Elias said, "or I put a bullet through the firepot, and either way nobody is marking anybody this morning. That's the only 2 options available to you right now, and one of them is considerably more convenient for your fence posts." The yard held its breath the way yards hold it before they decide which story they are going to tell about the morning. The young man tending the iron looked at Doss, waiting. The iron trembled slightly in his grip, not from the weight of it, from the weight of the moment. Doss's hand left Ren's shoulder. She felt its absence the way you feel the stopping of a sound you had stopped consciously hearing, suddenly and completely present in its going. Her shoulders dropped a quarter inch without her deciding to let them. She did not run to the stranger. She did not run at all. She stood, wrists still bound, and looked at the man with the leveled gun the way she had learned to look at every new thing that entered her life, with the specific wariness of a woman who had been handed arrangements that looked like rescues before and understood what they actually were. "I don't know you," she said. It was the first thing she had said all morning that was not an apology. "No," Elias agreed. He had not lowered the gun. Then why? He looked at her directly for the first time since entering the yard. His eyes were the gray-brown of creek water in October, and they did not perform kindness or sympathy or any of the other things men's eyes sometimes performed at her when they wanted her to find them trustworthy. "Because I watched this exact morning happen once before," he said, "to someone I loved, and I was 3 days too late to stop it. I'm not 3 days too late this time. That's the whole reason. It's not about you yet. It might be eventually. Today it's just about the iron not touching your skin." It was, Ren would think much later, the most honest thing any man had said to her in 6 years. Precisely because it made no promises beyond the one being kept right now, in this yard, in front of 61 men who were deciding, one by one, that they would rather be somewhere else. Doss looked around the ring with the careful eyes of a man conducting a private inventory, counting which of his 62 witnesses could still be relied upon for silence, and finding the number smaller than he'd expected. The older man near the northwest gap had reached the tree line. 2 others had shifted their horses to face outward. "Fine," Doss said, loud enough for the fence line, folding the retreat into the cadence of a man making a considered choice rather than a man being backed into a corner. "Take the debt with you. See how far paper carries you when it's not backed by land and men who know the territory." He turned and walked toward the house without looking back, because looking back would have told the fence line something he could not afford for it to know. The 62 men began to disperse, slowly, in the manner of crowds that have collectively decided not to discuss what they have just witnessed. Elias holstered the gun. Ren looked at him one more time, measuring. "Wherever we're going," she said, "I want terms. In writing. Not a handshake, not a promise, not a man's word across a fence. I've had all 3 of those and I know what they're worth." "Fair," he said. "I mean it. Where we're going, how long, what you expect in return. All of it." "We're going to Sycamore Bend," Elias said. "There's a boarding house there run by a woman named Verity Hale. The room has a bolt that locks from the inside. I expect nothing returned beyond you not running off with my horse." A pause. "We can discuss the rest of it on the road. You've been in that yard long enough." She studied him for another 3 seconds. Then she walked to his horse, and he helped her mount without being asked for permission to touch her arm to do it, which told her something. Small things told her more than large ones these days. They rode out of Doss Hollow on the same horse, 4 miles of September grassland between them and whatever came next, and Ren spent those 4 miles as in a silence so complete that Elias did not attempt to fill it. He seemed to understand that she needed the silence the way she needed air, that she had been performing composure all morning in front of 62 witnesses, and that the performance was over now, and what was left underneath it required space rather than conversation. Her fingers found, beneath her outer dress, the length of rusted chain she wore looped twice around her waist, buckled with a scrap of leather. She had worn it since she was 17, not because it was useful, but because the weight of it against her hip was a daily reminder that some things could be carried as choices rather than forced onto the body as marks. The brand would have been permanent. The chain was something she had decided on herself. For 6 years, she had needed at least one thing on her body that was a decision rather than a sentence. "You'll want it written out," she said when 4 miles had done enough work on the silence. "Whatever this arrangement is, already said yes to that. I'm saying it again because men say yes to things in yards and forget them on roads. Then we'll write it when we get there," Elias said. "Verity Hale has paper and she keeps a notary's seal for guests who need things made official. We can put whatever you want on the page before you sleep tonight." Ren looked out at the flat gold country, the dry creek beds, the cottonwoods bent sideways by some long Ago wind that had never been corrected. She found herself, despite herself, beginning to catalog the landscape the way she had cataloged Doss's house for 6 years. Water sources, roads, the direction of the afternoon light, where a person could go if she needed to go somewhere quickly. She caught herself doing it and made herself stop. This was not Doss Hollow. She did not yet know what it was. "The person you were too late for," she said eventually. "You don't have to tell me who. I know. I'm not asking. I know that too." He shifted the reins in his left hand. His right arm, the one with the scar, rested along his thigh. "Not today. Today's cost you enough without me adding a story to it." She found, against her expectations, that she was grateful for the refusal. A man who gave you everything in the first 4 miles was a man performing generosity rather than practicing it. And she had learned, over 6 years of watching Harlan Doss perform things for audiences, to distrust performances above nearly everything else. Sycamore Bend was a town of one real street and a dozen buildings with fronts that promised more prosperity than the interiors delivered, perched at the edge of a creek that ran properly in spring and barely at all in September. The boarding house sat at the northern end, a two-story frame building with a porch that faced west and a garden along the south side that had been planted with more care than most gardens in towns this size. Verity Hale met them at the door before they had finished tying the horse. She was a woman somewhere past 50, with the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have run establishments alone long enough that every gesture has been edited down to its essential form. She looked at Ren once, at the marks on her wrists from the strap, at the way she held herself with that careful, upright tension, and made a series of decisions in the space of about 4 seconds that she communicated to no one. "Room's on the second floor," Verity said. "Faces east. Bolt on the inside, not the outside." She paused. "Water's hot until 9. There's soap on the washstand." She did not ask about the wrists. She did not ask about where Ren had come from or what had happened there. She simply stepped aside and let her through. And that act of not asking was, in its way, the first genuinely kind thing anyone had done for Ren in longer than she could clearly remember. The room had one window facing east, a bed with a quilt that had been washed recently enough to still smell faintly of lye soap, and a door with a bolt. Ren crossed to the bolt before she crossed to the window. She slid it home 3 times, testing the mechanism, feeling the specific click of metal finding its seat before she was satisfied. Each click did something to the muscles in her shoulders that 6 years of Doss Hollow had wound as tight as fence wire. She sat on the edge of the bed, which had never been assigned to her use before, and was therefore a thing she had not yet learned to be suspicious of. And she let herself cry for exactly the length of time it took a short candle to burn down to its holder, because she had made herself a promise years ago that grief, like hope, required a budget. She was not going to overspend on either. Then she washed her face, smoothed her hair, and went down to find Verity Hale's paper and put the terms of this arrangement into writing before she slept. Elias was at the table in the front room with a cup of coffee he had clearly not been asked if he wanted but had been given anyway. In the particular manner of boarding houses that understood hospitality as something practiced rather than offered. He looked up when Ren came down the stairs. She sat across from him without being invited to because she had spent 6 years waiting for invitations and she was done with that particular habit. "Terms," she said. He set down the cup. "Terms. I'm not working for you. I'm not owing you. Whatever this is, it doesn't go on a ledger with my name in it." "Agreed. If I decide in a month that I want to work for the dry goods store and live in this town and never see you again beyond passing on the street, that's what happens. You don't have a claim on where I go once Doss is dealt with." Elias looked at her with the steady attention of a man who was not offended by any of this, which itself told her something. Men who intended eventually to convert a kindness into a debt tended to flinch at the explicit naming of it. "Agreed," he said again. "And if you don't want distance once Doss is dealt with, then I expect we'll have to figure out what the alternative looks like together, the same way we'll figure out everything else. Slowly and with more talking than either of us is probably used to." It was not a declaration of anything, it was a description of a process, and that, Ren understood, sitting in the lamplight of Verity Hale's front room with her wrists still marked from the morning, was the only kind of promise she was currently in any condition to receive. They wrote it down, all of it, on 2 pages of Verity's paper, and Verity herself signed as witness without reading a word of what was on the page, because a woman who had run a boarding house alone for 20 years understood when her signature was a kindness rather than a transaction. Ren kept both copies. She slept that night in a room with a bolt she had tested herself, facing east, and when morning came through the window with the particular quality of light that arrives before the street wakes up and before anyone has made any demands on the day, she sat with it for a long time before she decided what to do with it. She had not had a morning that belonged to her in 6 years. She was not yet certain what a person did with such a thing, but she suspected the learning of it would take considerably less time than the unlearning of everything that had come before. On the 3rd morning, Ren went to the dry goods store run by a man named Aldrich, a broad, unhurried man who stocked his shelves with the particular care of someone who understood that in a town this size, running out of something was a social failing rather than a commercial one. She had heard from Verity that his wife's hands had gone bad with joint sickness and that he had 3 baskets of mending with no one willing to do the fine work. She offered her services before he had finished explaining the situation. "Pays fair," Aldrich said with the careful courtesy of a man who had decided, on no evidence beyond her bearing, that she was someone who should be spoken to as though her answer mattered. $1.50 a basket based on the quality of the work. It was the first wage she had ever been quoted rather than withheld, the first job she had ever been offered rather than assigned. She said yes before the number had finished landing. That afternoon, she sat in Verity Hale's kitchen with the first basket in her lap, and her hands found again the skill her mother had given her before illness had taken both parents within a single season. The needle moved through the fabric with the practiced ease of something the body remembers even when the mind has been occupied elsewhere for years, and she worked until the light went, and Verity had to bring a lamp to the table without being asked. You've been doing that since childhood, Verity said, watching. My mother's work, Ren said. She could mend anything. Said a careful stitch was a way of saying that what you were repairing was worth repairing. Good philosophy, Verity said, and went back to her own work without elaborating. She had a gift for that, for offering a response that created space rather than filling it. Elias found her in the kitchen the following morning, earlier than he'd expected, already on the second basket. He had been, Verity had mentioned in passing, spending his days in some combination of riding the surrounding roads, watching the approaches to Sycamore Bend, and exchanging letters with a marshal's contact 2 territories east. Come with me, he said, half-mile out of town, dry creek bed. Bring nothing you'd mind getting dusty. She looked at him over the mending. Why? Because you asked me to teach you to shoot, and the offer still stands, and there's no better time than before the town wakes up. She set down the needle and followed him. The creek bed was a flat, pale stretch of dry ground between 2 low banks, sheltered from the road by a stand of scrub oak that had given up being graceful sometime around the last drought. He had set 3 fence posts in the dirt at varying distances, close enough to learn on, far enough to matter. He showed her the gun once, the weight and balance of it, where the hammer sat, where her thumb needed to be, and where it absolutely could not be. Then he stepped back. Try. She was a poor shot the first morning. She knew it and did not perform frustration about it, which he seemed to notice. The second morning she was better. Not good. Better. By the 5th morning, she was putting 3 of 5 rounds into the nearest post at 20 paces, with a consistency that came not from natural talent but from the specific kind of patience that belongs to someone who has learned to absorb information quietly over a long stretch of time and apply it without requiring the process to be faster than it is. You've got a soldier's patience, Elias said, watching her reload with the deliberate care of someone treating the motion as something worth learning correctly rather than quickly. Most people want to be good at this by the 2nd morning. You're willing to be poor at it for a week so you can be right at it for the rest of your life. I've had practice being patient, Ren said. 6 years of it. Turns out it's useful for more than surviving. She thought, standing there in the morning light with the gun in her hands, of all the small competencies Doss Hollow had extracted from her over the years without her consent. The precise fold of a sheet, the correct proportion of salt in a cure, the particular silence required when certain visitors came to the house. Every one of those skills had been taken from her, pulled from her hands and her mind and put in service of someone else's comfort and someone else's ledger. This was different. This was a skill she was building herself, for herself, aimed at nothing but her own protection. The difference sat in her chest like a coal that had finally been placed correctly in the grate, the kind of warmth that comes from a thing being in the right position at last rather than just burning wherever it happened to land. Elias taught her the way good teachers teach, through correction rather than instruction, through the slight adjustment of her wrist angle on the 3rd day, the repositioning of her stance on the 4th, each change offered without commentary on the previous error, as though the goal was competence rather than acknowledgement of its previous absence. She taught him in return. Not shooting, something more specific. She showed him the way Harlan Doss formed his numbers in private correspondence, a habit she had memorized over 6 years of dusting the study and reading, without permission, the shapes of letters she had not yet been allowed to understand the meaning of. She copied the handwriting from memory onto a scrap of paper and showed him how the man made his 3s look like 8s if you did not know to look for the small secondary curve. That's not penmanship, Elias said, studying the paper with the attention of a man who had spent years learning to read documents for the things they tried not to say. That's a man building ambiguity into his own fraud. That's exactly what it is, Ren said. I just didn't have a word for it until just now. Trust, she was learning, built like a dry stone wall. One flat piece tested for stability before the next one went on top. Nothing fixed with mortar. Everything depending on the placement. By the end of the 2nd week, she could sit across from him at Verity's supper table in a silence that did not require either of them to fill it. This was a thing she had believed 1 month ago she would never again be capable of with any man. Silence in Doss's house had been a held breath waiting for the next demand. Silence here was just silence. Opal Mears arrived on the 9th day. She came on foot the last 6 miles because the wagon that had carried her the first 12 had turned east toward its own destination and she had not asked it to stop. She arrived at Verity Hale's front door with road dust to her knees, a bruise along one cheekbone she did not explain, and a bundle wrapped in flour sacking that she set on the kitchen table with the specific care of someone transporting the only thing salvageable from a burning house. She had been Doss Hollow's cook for 11 years. She had watched every branding morning the ranch had held from behind a tray of biscuits she was never permitted to put down, regardless of what was happening in the yard. She had never been allowed to stop serving. She had run the night after Ren did, once she understood that Doss's search for a source inside his own household had fixed entirely and incorrectly on her. Verity gave her the room at the end of the hall without being asked to, and brought a basin of hot water without being asked to, and Opal sat at the kitchen table afterward with both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she was not drinking. Ren sat across from her and waited. Opal unwrapped the bundle. Inside, a child's hair ribbon gone gray with age. 3 pressed flowers, too dry now to identify by anything beyond their shapes. A small tin locket the size of a thumbnail, its hinge rusted, completely shut. Different women, Opal said. Different years. I kept what I could when they left, because nobody else was going to remember they'd been there. Didn't seem right, letting a woman disappear from a place without so much as a ribbon left behind to prove she'd existed. Ren picked up the locket carefully, turning it in her palm. The metal was warm from the bundle. The hinge would not move. "There are 6 names in that ledger before mine," Ren said quietly. "Doss told me that much once, not meaning to." 7 now, Opal said. She looked at Ren directly, the specific look of a woman delivering information she has been carrying too long to carry any further. The ledger's behind the second panel of the bookshelf in the study. Not his account book, a different one. I've watched him open it more times than he knows anyone was counting. It's not a record of money owed. A pause deliberate as a door closing. It's a record of women purchased. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when a suspicion becomes a confirmed fact with a number attached to it. Then Opal said the other thing. The thing Ren had not let herself think clearly in 8 months, because thinking it clearly would have required her to decide what to do with it, and for 8 months she had not been in any position to do anything at all. Della Pruitt didn't fall from a horse, Opal said. She was caught 11 miles out, brought back, and she didn't come back to the ranch. That's the last I know, but she didn't fall. Ren set the locket down on the table. The morning Della ran, Ren had known. In the way that women in certain situations know the things they are not permitted to say they know, she had understood, watching the set of Odell Grant's face when he rode in alone that afternoon, that the story about the horse was not a story about a horse. She had understood it, and served supper that evening in the kitchen of Harlan Doss's house, and said nothing, because saying something would have cost her more than it could possibly have returned, and she had made the arithmetic of that calculation and come out on the other side, still alive and hating herself for the survival. "I served supper that week," Ren said. Her hands were flat on the table. "I said nothing. I kept my head down and I said nothing because I told myself there wasn't a version where speaking up saved her, only a version where it put me in the ground next to her." "That's the truth," Opal said. "There wasn't a version." "I know that," Ren said. Knowing it doesn't make the weight of it any lighter. She sat with it for a long moment. Elias, across the table, said nothing because he understood that this was not a moment that required anything from him beyond the willingness to stay in it. Then Ren looked at Opal. "We need that ledger," she said. Her voice had changed. Something had settled in it the way a river settles after the point where it stops being rain and starts being current. "Not for me, for Della, for all 7 names in that book. If Doss has written down what he's done in his own hand, in his own house, then it's not a rumor anyone can dismiss. It's a record. And records can be read in courtrooms." Opal looked at her steadily. "Getting it means going back," Elias said. "I know the house better than anyone he's hired since I left," Ren said. "I know which floorboard creaks outside the study and which window latch sticks in the heat and what time the kitchen goes quiet. You want to stop him with a gun in a yard. I want to stop him with the one thing he's more afraid of than a gun." She touched the edge of the locket gently. His own handwriting, read aloud by someone with the authority to make it matter. The candle on the table had burned down to a stub. Outside, the town had settled into its last sounds of the evening, a dog somewhere, a door closing, the creek running lower than it had any right to in September. Ren picked up the locket again and held it for a moment. Whoever had owned it had pressed a hinge shut rather than let it be taken from them, had chosen what to close rather than have it opened by someone else. She understood that instinct completely. They rode to Milbrook the following morning, Ren and Elias, leaving before the town had fully decided to be awake. The road east ran through country that had given up on shade sometime around midsummer and not yet reconsidered, flat grassland broken by dry washes, and the occasional stand of cottonwood that looked as though it had been placed there by someone who understood the concept of shelter without having the resources to execute it properly. Ren rode without speaking for the first hour, which Elias had come to understand was not absence but process. She was the kind of person who thought before she talked, genuinely thought, turned things over until she had found the angle she wanted, and only then opened her mouth. He had known men who operated the same way. He had found it more striking in her, perhaps because 6 years of being owned had not managed to take it from her. The county seat at Milbrook was 3 hours east, a town that had briefly imagined itself a city and then revised its ambitions downward to something more sustainable. The recorder's office sat between a land assay business and a lawyer's shingle, so weathered the name had become more suggestion than information. A clerk at the front told them the county recorder was in the back and that he didn't take walk-ins before 9, which was in 11 minutes, and they could wait on the bench or not, his manner suggesting a mild preference for not. They waited on the bench. Silas Pruitt came out at 9 with the precision of a man for whom punctuality was a moral position rather than a convenience. He was past 60, with the dry, particular tidiness of someone who had spent decades in the company of documents and had absorbed something of their nature. He wore spectacles on a chain and moved his files with the care of a man who trusted paper more thoroughly than he trusted most of the people who produced it. He looked at Ren and Elias across his desk with the measured attention of a man deciding how seriously to take what had not yet been said. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "Bills of sale," Elias said. "Filed under the name Harlan Doss, Doss Hollow, over the past 5 to 6 years. Any transaction describing the transfer of a person against an outstanding debt." Pruitt regarded him for a moment. Then he stood and went to his files without another word. He was gone for 14 minutes. Ren counted them. When he returned, he carried 3 folders and set them on the desk with the unhurried precision of a man who had found exactly what he expected and was not pleased about it. 3, he said. Filed in 1878, 1880, and 1882. Each describes a woman, given name only, transferred to satisfy a debt owed to 1H Doss, destination not specified, price noted as paid in full. He adjusted his spectacles and tapped the top folder. In each case, the document bears Doss's signature twice, once as creditor, once as witness. Ren looked at the folders. "He witnessed his own transaction," she said. "He did, which is not technically illegal witnessing. A witness is meant to be a disinterested party. A man cannot witness on his own behalf." Pruitt set his spectacles back on his nose. "Beyond that, a debt sale of this nature requires the signature of the debtor. The person whose debt is being transferred must agree to the transfer in writing, with 2 legitimate witnesses. I see no such signature in any of these 3 documents. I see only Doss's hand twice on each." "Would a court see what you're seeing?" Ren asked. Pruitt looked at her directly. "A court would see it in approximately 4 seconds, miss. The issue in this territory has never been whether fraud can be proven once someone looks at the evidence." A pause, precise and deliberate as everything else about him. "The issue has been finding someone with the authority and the inclination to look." He slid the 3 folders across the desk. "I can make you copies. These are county records, and they don't leave this office, but copies are your right to have." He was already reaching for clean paper. "If you're building toward a courtroom, take everything you can carry. A man like Doss doesn't fall on one document. He requires burying under several." While Pruitt made the copies with the clerk's precise hand, Ren sat in the chair across from his desk and looked at the original documents without touching them. The handwriting was familiar. She had spent 6 years in proximity to it, reading the shape of it from corners and door frames without permission, memorizing the particular way Doss formed certain letters because the body cataloged things the mind had not yet caught up to assigning meaning. She found the 3s that looked like 8s if you did not know to look. Found them in the debt amounts, which told her that the numbers recorded here were not the numbers that had actually changed hands. That even the fraudulent documents contained a second layer of fraud nested inside the first. "He doctored the amounts," she said quietly, more to herself than to Elias. He was beside her in 2 steps. She pointed without touching the paper. "There, and there. The amount recorded doesn't match what I heard him quote to the cattle buyer last spring. He quotes different numbers to different people and records a 3rd number in the official filing. 3 separate figures for the same transaction." Elias looked at the documents for a long moment. "That's not just fraud," he said. "That's a man who has been practicing this long enough that he's built redundancy into the deception. He has an answer prepared for every version of the number someone might challenge him on. He's been doing this for at least 15 years, Ren said. "The ledger at the house goes back to 1869. These 3 documents are the surface of it, the ones that were filed publicly because he felt safe enough to file them. The ledger is the rest." Pruitt returned with the copies, folded into a canvas envelope. He handed them to Ren rather than to Elias, which she noted, and found she appreciated without being able to articulate precisely why. "If you get to a courtroom," Pruitt said, "and I hope you do, come back here first. I'll testify to what I've just shown you. I've been the keeper of this county's records for 22 years. And I have never once signed my name to something I wasn't willing to stand behind in a room full of strangers." He looked at her steadily. "Someone should have looked at these 3 years ago. I regret that someone wasn't me." It was not an apology exactly. It was something more useful than an apology. It was a commitment. They rode back toward Sycamore Bend with the copies inside Ren's coat against her chest and the afternoon light coming at them sideways from the west, long and flat and gold the way September light in Wyoming gets when it has decided to be beautiful about leaving. "He built the whole thing to outlast any single challenge," Ren said after the first mile. "Every piece of it designed so that by the time someone found one layer, there were 2 more underneath it. The debt that renewed itself, the public filings that looked legitimate, the private ledger that recorded the truth he couldn't put in the public filings. He thought about this for years before he started. Men like him always do," Elias said. "The planning is part of what they are. It's not incidental to the crime. It is the crime assembled over time, tested against each failure until the parts that held were the parts that stayed. Then we need the part that doesn't hold," Ren said. "The ledger. His own record in his own hand of what he actually did. Not the version he filed with Pruitt with the doctored numbers and the absent signatures. The version he wrote for himself because he needed to keep track of the truth even while he was hiding it from everyone else." "Getting it means going back," Elias said. He said it not as an objection but as an inventory of cost, the way a man names the price of something before agreeing to pay it. "I know," Ren said. "I've known since Opal told us about the second shelf panel. There was never another option. There was only the question of when and how. They rode in silence for a while. "Tell me about the house," Elias said, so she told him. She had memorized it the way a person memorizes the inside of any space they have inhabited under constraint, completely and involuntarily, every detail pressed into memory by the repetition of daily necessity. She described the kitchen door that required lifting on its hinge before it would open quietly, a trick she had performed every morning for 6 years hauling wash water before the household woke. The floorboard outside the study, third from the left, that telegraphed wait with a sound like a branch under snow. The window on the study's north wall, whose latch had swollen in the summer heat and never been repaired because Doss used the door and had no reason to notice. The room where the second hired man now slept, added to the payroll since Ren's departure, positioned at the south end of the house to cover the most likely approach. Elias listened with the specific attention of a man converting information into geometry, mapping the space in his mind, calculating where the risks collected and where they thinned. "We go north," he said, "through the kitchen garden. Same direction you came in every morning." "The kitchen garden gate squeaks," Ren said. "Lift it before you push. You'll show me." Yes, they spent 3 days in preparation. Opal drew the floor plan of the house on the back of a feed receipt from memory, marking the study, the 2 interior hallways, the position of the second hired man's room, the location of Doss's own bedroom on the east side of the house. She marked the second bookshelf panel with a small cross and noted that the ledger sat behind it in a leather sleeve, horizontal, because Doss had shelved it that way to make it look like an architectural feature rather than a concealed compartment. Elias arranged for Whitfield Morrow, Aldrich's eldest son, to position himself on the road a half-mile from the ranch with a fast horse and instructions to ride for Sycamore Bend and send word to the territorial marshal's office the moment anything went wrong. Whitfield was 17 and had the particular eagerness of a young man who has not yet had the opportunity to do something that seemed likely to matter, and he accepted the assignment with a gravity that suggested he understood the difference between the errand and the purpose behind it. Ren spent the 3 days continuing to work on Aldrich mending baskets in the mornings, because she had decided that the work itself was important, not merely as income, but as a daily practice of choosing her own labor rather than having it assigned to her. She was not going to stop living in order to plan. Living was the point. The plan was in service of the living, not the other way around. On the second evening, Odell Grant found them. He was waiting at the edge of Sycamore Bend, where the road narrowed into scrub oak, sitting on a fence post with his hat in his hands rather than on his head, the posture of a man who has come to say something and is not certain he has earned the right to say it. Ren saw him first and stopped walking. He stood when he saw her, did not reach for anything, kept his hands visible and his hat between them, which was either deliberate or instinct and amounted to the same thing. "I cinched that strap," he said, without introduction or preamble. "Your wrists?" "The morning in the yard. I've thought of little else since I did it. Wanted you to know I quit the ranch 2 days after you left. Told Doss I was finished being the hand that did his tying." Ren looked at him for a long moment. He was not a young man. He had the look of someone who had spent many years making the reasonable choice in unreasonable situations and had finally run out of reasonable to offer as a justification. "Why tell me now?" she said. "Why not before I left the yard?" "Because before I was a coward," Odell said. "And telling you then would have been asking you to forgive a coward before he'd done anything to deserve it. I didn't want forgiveness. I wanted to have done something worth forgiving first." He turned the hat once in his hands. "I know where the second hired man's room is. Know he's a heavy sleeper after midnight, because Doss lets him keep a bottle of rye, and the man is not disciplined about its use. Thought that information might be useful to somebody." He looked at neither of them specifically. "Don't need to know what you're planning. Just wanted to be of use to someone who wasn't him for once in my life." Elias studied him with the careful assessment of a man deciding whether an offered gift was actually a gift. Ren made the decision before Elias finished assessing. "We'll take the information," she said. "And Odell." She waited until he looked at her directly. "I watched you in that yard for 6 years. You followed his orders. You also never once looked at me the way some of the others did. I noticed that. I'm telling you now because I think you should know someone noticed." Odell nodded once, something in his face releasing without quite softening. He put his hat back on and walked back toward town without another word. And Ren watched him go and understood that she had just witnessed the particular, private variety of redemption that never appears in any official record. The kind that happens between 2 people on a road at dusk and is witnessed only by the scrub oak and the fading light, and whatever part of a person keeps track of the moments when something shifts from one side of a line to the other. The night they chose was moonless, the way the best nights for this kind of work always are. They left Sycamore Bend at 10:30 on horseback, moving at the pace of people who did not want to arrive early and did not want to arrive late, who had calculated the interval between the second hired man's last drink and his deepest sleep, and had added 20 minutes for margin and felt reasonably confident in the arithmetic. Whitfield Morrow was at his post before they passed him. He lifted 2 fingers from the fence rail as they went by. Ren lifted 2 back. The road to Doss Hollow ran through country she had traveled 6 years ago in the opposite direction. Sitting behind Elias on a horse she had not yet learned to trust, and the reversal of the direction felt significant in the way reversals sometimes do, not symbolically, but practically, as though the road itself had a different texture when walked with a purpose rather than away from one. They left the horses in a dry wash a quarter-mile from the ranch and went the rest of the way on foot. Through the kitchen garden, gate lifted before pushed, no sound. The garden itself was in the state of late September neglect that suggested whoever had taken over Ren's duties had not considered it a priority, and the path between the beds was easier than she remembered. The kitchen door lifted on its hinge exactly as she had described it to Elias in 3 days of preparation. It opened without a sound and they were inside. The familiar smell of the house arrived first before the darkness resolved into shapes. Wood smoke and the particular mustiness of a building that was kept closed rather than air. Lye soap from the kitchen. Something underneath it, all that she had stopped consciously noticing after the first year, and was now noticing again with the sharpened attention of someone approaching rather than inhabiting. Elias's hand rested on the small of her back in the narrow hallway between the kitchen and the study corridor, not directing, only present. She moved and he followed, each step placed with the deliberateness of someone who had memorized a map and was now reading it with their feet. The third floorboard from the left outside the study did not creak. She had spent 3 days hoping it wouldn't, and she had been right to prepare for it anyway, because hope and preparation were not the same thing, and she had learned to practice both without confusing them. The study door was unlocked, as it always was after midnight, because Harlan Doss had never believed that a debt could find its own way home. He was wrong about that. Ren had found her way home to the exact place she needed to be, and she would be taking something from it when she left. The second bookshelf panel came away from the wall with a soft compression of air, a sound like a book closing in a quiet room, and she caught it with her palm before it could go further. Behind it, in the dark, the leather sleeve exactly where Opal had described it, horizontal, heavier than she'd expected when she pulled it out. She set it on the desk and opened it under the thinnest thread of lantern light Elias had adjusted down to its minimum, barely enough to read by, exactly enough. The first page was dated 1869. A name at the top, Adeline Doss. Ren stopped. She had known there were names before hers, 7 counting her. She had not been prepared for the first name to be the name of Harlan Doss's own wife. She read the entry quickly, the date, the amount, the destination listed only as East, transferred, and the note in the margin in Doss's distinctive hand that she recognized from 6 years of unauthorized reading, Beckett told. Story set, she understood what she was looking at, not a debt transaction, a disposal. The record of a man removing his own wife from his household using the same mechanism he would later use on 7 women he had no personal connection to, and constructing a story for a 6-year-old child that the child had apparently believed for 14 years without finding a reason to question it. She was still reading when the door opened. She did not reach for the gun. Her hand went to the page instead, steadying it, because her first instinct was to protect the evidence rather than herself, and she would think about that later and decide it had been the right instinct. Beckett Doss stood in the doorway. He was 20 years old, which made him her exact contemporary, though she had never exchanged more than a dozen words with him across 6 years of sharing a house, because the household had been arranged to make certain categories of contact unlikely. He had his father's jaw and none of his father's particular stillness. He stood in the doorframe with his hand still on the knob, wearing the look of a man who has entered a room expecting to find it empty and has found it containing something considerably more complicated than emptiness. 3 full seconds passed. Ren did not move. She did not close the ledger. She looked at him across the desk in the thin lantern light and made a decision in approximately the time it takes to draw a breath. She turned to the first page. She pushed the ledger across the desk toward him. Beckett's eyes went down to the page. She watched his face, read the name at the top, watched it change, watched 14 years of a story about a woman who had walked away from her family resolve suddenly into the truth of what the page said, which was that the woman had not walked away at all, that the walking had been arranged by someone who had needed the walking to look voluntary. The date of transfer, a price, a destination listed as East, Beckett told. Story set. He had been 6 years old. The story had been set for him by the man who had produced the ledger entry in the first place, and he had carried it for 14 years because carrying it had been the only option available to a child, and then because questioning it had eventually become more expensive than continuing to believe it, and then because there comes a point in any long deception where the deception is so thoroughly integrated into a person's understanding of their own life that examining it feels like examining the floor you are standing on. He read for 60 seconds the page, the margin note, the date. His hands were shaking, not trembling, shaking the specific movement of a body processing something that the mind is several seconds behind on. Ren waited. She didn't leave, Beckett said. His voice was the voice of a man speaking from somewhere very far back from the surface of himself. No, Ren said. None of them left. Not on their own terms. Every name in this ledger is a woman your father decided he could hold more completely than he was willing to admit in any room with a window. Beckett turned pages. She let him. He had earned the looking, more than she could calculate in the 30 seconds she had known he was in the room, and she was not going to take it from him because she was in a hurry. He found 3 pages further an entry dated April 1882, a name D. Pruitt, a destination, North transferred, a price. He looked up. "This is the woman who fell from the horse," he said. It was not quite a question. "It's the woman who was caught 11 miles out and transferred north," Ren said. "That's what this page says. In your father's hand." Beckett closed the ledger with both hands. The gesture had the specific quality of a person finishing something they had not chosen to begin. He stood with his hands on the cover for a moment, and the room held the particular stillness of a place where something has just permanently changed. Then he lifted his hands, stepped back from the desk, crossed to the door. He opened it wider than it had been and stepped fully to the side. "Take it," he said. "Take all of it." His jaw had set in a way that made him look, briefly, like his father, except that the expression on his father's face when his jaw set like that was the expression of a man deciding he could do something. The expression on Beckett's face was the expression of a man deciding he could not continue not doing something. The difference was everything. "When this comes to a courtroom," he said, "and it will, if there is any justice remaining in this territory worth the name, I will be there. I'll testify. Every word, every page." He looked at the ledger one more time, then looked away. "I owe her that, 14 years late." "You don't owe it only to her," Elias said quietly from behind Ren. He had not spoken since they entered the house. His voice in the small room was very calm. "You owe it to yourself as well. A man who tells the truth the day he knows it is not the same man who spent 14 years not asking. That's worth something, Beckett. It might be worth quite a lot, depending on how the next few months go." Beckett nodded once. He did not look back as they passed him, and she did not look back at him, and they moved back through the hall and the kitchen with the ledger wrapped in the oilcloth Elias had brought for exactly this purpose, and out through the kitchen garden, with the gate lifted quiet on its hinge and into the dark. They were 200 yards from the house when the dogs woke. Not the household dogs. A dog in the far pen that Ren had forgotten, a recent addition kept near the south approach. She heard it and felt the knowledge of what the sound meant arrive in her chest before she had consciously processed it. "Move," Elias said. They moved. The horses were in the dry wash where they had left them, and they were mounted before the first light appeared in the upper window of the house, and they were onto the road north before the second light appeared. Elias had the ledger against his chest under the oilcloth and his coat buttoned over both. They had covered perhaps 1.5 miles. Sycamore Bend 2.5 miles further, the road empty and dark and smelling of dry grass and September cold, when the riders came out of the tree line on the east side of the road. 3 of them. The first shot went wide and high, the deliberate miss of a warning. The second did not miss deliberately. It went through the crown of Elias's hat and close enough to his ear that she heard the air move. Elias wheeled his horse hard left and returned fire twice, controlled shots at the muzzle flash rather than the shapes behind it, enough to interrupt the second rider's next shot and send him back toward the tree line to reconsider. Ren's horse had gone to the right instinctively, and she brought it back with both knees, the way Elias had shown her the third week, pressure rather than direction, steady rather than sharp. The third rider came around the south flank. He came fast and low, and his angle was not toward Elias. His angle was toward her, the direct line that would put his horse between her and the road north, cutting the route, cutting her off from anything beyond the next 50 yards. She had 4 seconds, approximately. She did not think about the dry creek bed. She did not think about the fence posts or the mornings or the specific correction of her wrist angle on the third day. None of it arrived as thought. It arrived as motion, the gun out and the stance found, and the arm braced the way the arm had learned to brace it through repetition patient, enough to make the motion available in exactly this kind of moment. One shot, the rider's shoulder. He went sideways in the saddle, horse veering with the sudden shift in weight, and he did not close the gap, and he did not come back around for a second approach, and the road north was open. She felt in the half-second after the shot, a thing she had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction in any clean sense. Something more complicated than that. The specific grounded certainty of a person who has done a hard thing they prepared for, and found that the preparation held when the moment arrived, and understood that the preparation had been an act of self-respect before it was an act of anything else. "Ride," Elias said. He was already favoring the left, the shoulder. She could see it in the way he held the rein. She had not heard the shot that hit him. She heard it now, in retrospect, in the changed angle of his body. She rode. The last 2 miles to Sycamore Bend she spent low over the horse's neck, watching his silhouette ahead of her in the dark, watching for the lean that would mean he was losing his grip on the saddle, staying close enough to be there if he did. He did not fall. He caught himself twice on the horn and kept riding, and she would think later, when there was time to think, that this was the most precise image she had of who he was, a man who nearly fell and caught himself, and did not call out for anyone to catch him, but who would not have refused the catching if she had offered it. Verity Hale had the front door open before they reached the porch. She had, as Ren would later come to understand, was characteristic of her, anticipated what she could not have known with the accuracy of a woman who had seen enough arrivals at that door to understand what certain kinds of urgency sounded like from a quarter-mile away. Elias made it through the door into the table and sat down with the controlled collapse of a man allowing himself to stop performing fine for exactly the minimum amount of time required to stop moving. Ren set the ledger on the table. She looked at it for 1 second, then she looked at Elias. She had learned, in the weeks since the corral yard, to assess damage with the practical directness of someone who understood that reaction was a luxury to be spent after the necessary things were done. She cut the coat away from the shoulder with Verity's kitchen scissors, while Verity brought water and cloth and a lamp turned up to full without being asked for any of it. The wound was a through and through, clean in the sense that mattered and not clean in several other senses. She cleaned it and packed it and bound it with the steady hands of a woman who had discovered, somewhere between the dry creek bed and the last 2 miles of road, that she was capable of a steadiness she had not known she possessed before she had needed it. Elias sat through it without speaking, not stoic performance, genuine quiet, the quiet of a man who had been through enough of this to understand that speaking during it didn't improve the outcome. When she finished, she did not move away from him. She sat with her hip against the edge of the table and her hands finally still after everything, and she looked at him in the lamplight of Verity Hale's kitchen, with the ledger on the table between them and the night outside going gray at the edges toward morning, and she said it. I love you. Her voice was even, not performed evenness. The evenness of a thing that had been true for some time and was now simply being stated, the way you state the name of a river you have been standing beside for a while. I'm not waiting for you to say it first, because that is how it is supposed to go. I spent 6 years waiting for men to make decisions about my life. I am finished waiting on this one. Elias looked at her. He had the look of a man who has been braced for a number of possible things and has just encountered something he had not specifically prepared for, which in his case was a significant achievement on the part of the something. He laughed, a short, genuine sound that pulled at the shoulder and made him wince and did not stop being genuine for either of those things. I've been trying to find the right 4 miles to say it since the ridge, he said. Every stretch I picked had someone shooting at us. You could have said it before the ridge. I could have, he agreed. I didn't think you'd believe anything said to you while you were still deciding whether I was another debt collector in a better coat. He reached across with his good arm and took her hand where it rested near the bandage, carefully, with the specific care of a man who understood that this particular hand had spent 6 years being used against its owner's will, and intended to proceed accordingly. I love you, Ren Callaway, he said, whatever name you decide to keep. Outside, the sky was beginning to make up its mind about morning. The ledger sat on the table between the lamp and the wall, its leather covered dark with age and the oilcloth's moisture, looking very much like what it was. A man's private record of the worst of himself, carried home in the coat of someone he had underestimated, by a woman who had planned for exactly this night while he planned for everything else. In the 2 days that followed, while Elias's shoulder began the slow work of deciding to heal, Ren made 3 copies of the ledger by hand at Verity's kitchen table. One she delivered to Sheriff Whitmore's office herself in daylight, with Aldrich and Verity present to witness the delivery and her stating aloud, clearly and in front of both of them, that she was leaving a copy of Harlan Doss's private ledger in the county sheriff's care as material evidence of fraud and forced servitude. One she paid a rider to carry south toward the territorial capital before first light, Aldrich's most reliable farmhand, someone with no connection to Doss Hollow and a fast horse and directions not to stop for anyone on the Doss land. One she placed under the floorboard, Verity showed her without being asked, lifting a corner plank in the back room with the practiced ease of a woman who had long ago decided that certain things needed to be kept in places that required more than a key to find. Then she waited, the way she had learned to wait for things that mattered, not performing patience, simply practicing it, the way she practiced the gun, the way she practiced the stitching, by doing the next right thing and allowing the outcome to arrive in its own time. Harlan Doss came to Sycamore Bend on the 2nd morning after that. He did not come with an army. He came with Sheriff Aldous Whitmore riding at his left, and a story assembled with the same careful architecture he applied to everything, rehearsed in the hours between discovering the ledger missing and arriving at the decision that the best way to recover it was to make its removal into a crime rather than a correction. He had a runaway debtor, he had a stolen document, he had a sheriff willing to give the story the shape of law, because Whitmore had been giving Doss's stories the shape of law for 15 years and had no clear route to stopping now. What he did not have and had not accounted for was his son standing on Verity Hale's porch when he rode in. The street had gathered the way streets gather when something is coming that people have been privately expecting without saying so aloud. Aldrich was in front of his store with the particular stillness of a man who has decided to witness something whether or not he has been invited to. Verity Hale stood at the edge of her own porch with her arms at her sides. Several others had found reasons to be on the boardwalk, in doorways, on the near side of the street where the view was unobstructed. Ren stood at the center of the porch. She had the ledger on the table beside her, open. Opal Mears stood at her left. Beckett Doss stood at her right, and the fact of his being there, on that side of the table, was the first thing Harlan Doss's eyes found when he cleared the end of the street and had an unobstructed view of what was waiting for him. Something happened to Doss's face in that moment. It was not the fury she might have expected, the immediate, hot variety that men of his type sometimes displayed when confronted with opposition. It was something older and colder than fury. The expression of a man watching the specific structure he has spent decades building begin to shift at its foundation, and understanding in the same instant that the shift has already passed the point where reinforcement is possible. He pulled his horse up 20 feet from the porch. Whitmore pulled up beside him and slightly behind, which told Ren everything she needed to know about where the sheriff's calculation had landed in the last 100 yards of riding. "That ledger is private property," Doss said. His voice was still controlled, still public-facing, still the voice of a man who believed that the right tone of authority could determine the outcome of a situation if applied with sufficient confidence. "Taken from my home by a runaway debtor and a man with a warrant outstanding. I'm here to recover what belongs to me and to see that the parties responsible are held to account under the laws of this territory." Ren let him finish. She had been thinking, in the 2 days since they had returned with the ledger, and Elias's wound had been cleaned, and the copies had been made and distributed, about the morning in the corral yard, about the specific way Doss had raised his voice at the moment he wanted the fence line to hear. About the way volume and audience were the same instrument to him, deployed together to make private arrangements look like public facts. She understood that instrument now. She had studied it for 6 years without knowing she was studying it. She raised her voice to exactly the level that carried to the edges of the gathered street. "This ledger," she said, "is not a record of money owed. It is a record of women purchased. 7 names, Mr. Doss. 7 counting mine, and the first name in it is not a debtor's name, it is your wife's name, Adeline Doss. Page 1, March 14th, 1869. She heard the street shift. The specific sound a gathered group makes when it receives information it was not prepared for, a collective adjustment, like a field of grass responding to wind. "Adeline didn't leave," Beckett said, from her right. His voice was steady with the steadiness of something that has cost a great deal to stabilize. "She's on page 1, transferred east." Price noted, "The margin says I was told a story. I was 6 years old." He looked at his father directly. "I believed that story for 14 years because I had no reason not to. I have a reason now." Doss's jaw worked. He looked at his son the way a man looks at something he built when he discovers it has failed in the specific way he designed it not to fail. Not with the anger of betrayal, precisely, but the specific, terrible recognition of a man finding that the one variable he believed he had controlled completely was the variable that had undone everything else. "You'd stand against your own blood," Doss said, low, the public voice gone entirely now, "for a servant girl and a man with a bounty warrant." "I'd stand against you," Beckett said, "for my mother. That's the only reason that matters to me, and it's sufficient." Whitmore's horse shifted under him. The sheriff did not reach for his weapon. His eyes were moving through the assembled street, doing the same calculation Doss had done in the corral yard 11 days ago, the same counting of faces and expressions and the specific tilt of public opinion that told a man whether the story he had committed to was going to hold, or whether it had already been decided against. He found his answer in the faces. He took one visible step backward with his horse, a single horse length of distance between himself and Harlan Doss, small enough to be argued away later as incidental, large enough to be seen by everyone present as what it was. Ren continued, "I want every person on this street to ask themselves a question," she said. "How many of you have wondered, quietly, in your own minds, where the women go who work Doss Hollow? How many of you have seen a woman arrive at that ranch and not seen her leave by any road you can account for? How many of you decided it was none of your concern?" She paused. "I understand that decision. I lived inside the reason for it for 6 years. A system built the way this one was built depends on people deciding it's none of their concern. That's not a failure of those people. That's a feature of the design. But it is your concern now, because this ledger is a record of 7 women, and it exists in your county, and it was kept by a man who has operated inside your community for 15 years with the confidence of someone who has correctly assessed how many people would keep their eyes on their own business." A woman near the front of the gathered street stepped forward. Ren did not know her. She would learn later that her name was Mrs. Harriet Ainsley, that she had been the schoolteacher in Sycamore Bend for 19 years and had taught 3 generations of the town's children to read and had strong opinions about the uses of literacy. "I've wondered," Mrs. Ainsley said, plainly without performance, looking at Doss rather than at Ren. "I've wondered for years and told myself it wasn't a matter I had any standing to raise. I was wrong about the standing. I simply lacked the courage the standing required." The admission opened something in the street. Other voices, not many but enough, confirming what she had said in their own terms, naming women they had known briefly and then not known at all, asking questions that had been sitting unasked for years in the private portions of their minds. Doss looked around the street one final time. Ren watched him do it. Watched him assess the faces the same way he had assessed the faces in the corral yard, and find the math working against him in the same way it had worked against him there, except that this time there was no Whitmore positioned to lend the proceedings the appearance of lawful oversight, and this time the ledger was open on the table, rather than locked behind a shelf panel, and this time his son was standing on the wrong side of the table. He turned his horse and rode out of Sycamore Bend without another word. Whitmore followed, one horse length behind, and did not look back at the gathered street as he went. Ren watched them go. She stood on that porch with the ledger open and the street still gathered, and Opal beside her and Beckett holding himself together with both hands on the porch rail, and she felt in that moment something she had not anticipated. Not triumph, not the fierce immediate satisfaction she had sometimes imagined in the dark of the boarding house room when she allowed herself to imagine this moment at all. What she felt was tired. Profoundly, specifically tired, the way you feel when you have been holding something heavy for a very long time and have just been allowed to set it down, and the muscles that were holding it don't know yet what to do with the absence of the weight. Elias came out from the doorway where he had been standing with his arm in the sling Verity had fashioned. He stopped beside her and looked at the street returning, slowly, to its ordinary business. "He'll run," Elias said. "He won't get far enough," Ren said. "Not with what's already on the road to the territorial capital." She was right about the second part. She was not entirely right about the first. Doss did not run, not in the way a man runs when he is afraid. He ran in the way a man runs when he is still, even now, convinced that the right action taken quickly enough can reverse the situation, that the problem is not the crime but the evidence, and that evidence, unlike truth, can be destroyed. He rode back to Doss Hollow and spent the afternoon writing 3 letters to men in neighboring territories who had participated in similar arrangements over the years, men whose names would later appear in the correspondence his deputies found in his study, warning them in the careful, indirect language of someone who has long practice at saying dangerous things without saying them outright, that the arrangement would require considerably more discretion going forward. 2 of these letters he did not send. He wrote them and set them on his desk and sat looking at them for a long time, and then he left them there, because the part of him that had built this system over 15 years did not fully believe yet that it was ending, and ending things he had not decided to end was not something he had ever been practiced at. The second thing he did was ride back into Sycamore Bend after midnight. He went to the sheriff's office. Whitmore, who had spent the evening doing his own version of Doss's calculation and arriving at his own conclusions about which way things were tilting, had not locked the door, whether out of resignation or complicity or some mixture of both that he would spend the rest of his life unsuccessfully sorting out. Doss went in, found the copy of the ledger that Ren had delivered to the office in daylight with 2 witnesses present, and he set fire to the building with the specific, focused efficiency of a man who has decided that fire is the solution to a paper problem. The fire caught fast in the dry September night and lit the street orange from 3 blocks away. The town came out of its houses. Buckets passed hand to hand in a line that formed without anyone giving the order to form it, because the line-forming instinct is older than the instinct to calculate whether the building is worth saving. And Sycamore Bend was a town made largely of wood, and the understanding of what fire meant in a town made largely of wood was as close to universal as anything in the territory. Beckett Doss was among the first out of the boarding house, still in his shirt sleeves, and he stood in the street watching the sheriff's office burn with an expression that Ren, standing beside him, could not fully read in the firelight because it contained too many things at once, grief and certainty and the specific, exhausted relief of a man who has made a decision and is watching its consequences arrive and finding that the consequences, terrible as they are preferable to the alternative of having not made it. "He's just handed us the rest of it," Elias said quietly, from Ren's other side. "I know," she said. "A man who burns a building to destroy evidence has, in front of witnesses, demonstrated that he believed the evidence was worth destroying. That's not a defense. That's a confession with fire as its medium." "I know," she said again. "I planned for it." Elias looked at her. "The 2 copies," she said. "One is under Verity's floor. One left for the territorial capital 2 days ago with a rider who took the southern route so he wouldn't cross paths with anyone riding from Doss Hollow." She watched the fire for a moment. "I've lived with a man who believed that destroying the evidence of a thing was the same as destroying the thing itself. I've known for 6 years that it isn't." Beckett was already speaking, not to her. To the assembled town, standing in the firelit street, turning to face the people who had come out of their houses to watch the building burn, and beginning to talk in the voice of a man who has decided that if he does not say it now in public in front of witnesses, he will find a way to not say it, and he is finished finding ways to not say things. He spoke for a long time. He spoke about the ledger and what was in it. He spoke about his mother, Adeline, and the story he had been given at 6, and the page he had read at 20, and the distance between those 2 things that he would be crossing for the rest of his life. He spoke about Della Pruitt, whose name appeared in April 1882 with a destination and a price, and about the fact that the story about a horse had not been a story about a horse, and about what it meant that he had been in that house while the story was being distributed and had not asked a single question because the asking had seemed less manageable than the not asking. His voice broke once on the word sold, and he did not stop talking when it broke, and the town listened with the specific quality of attention that people give to someone saying something they have needed to hear someone say for a long time. Ren watched the fire and let him speak, and did not add anything because he had earned the saying of it in a way that could not be shared without being diminished, and because she understood that what the town needed in this moment was not her voice but his. Not the voice of the woman who had been wronged, but the voice of the man who had inherited the benefit of the wrongdoing without knowing it, and was now, publicly, returning what he could of it. Marshal Virgil Coates arrived on the third morning. He was a broad, unhurried man who had the look of someone who had been riding hard for 2 days and had decided somewhere along the way that looking as though he had been riding hard was a choice he could make or not make, and had elected not to. He came in dust-covered but composed, with 2 deputies in a manner that suggested he had seen enough of this particular variety of crime across enough territories that the sight of it no longer surprised him, which was, Ren understood, both a reassurance and a grief. He took statements in Verity Hale's front room at the table that had become over the preceding weeks the center of this particular operation. Opal first, then Beckett, then Elias, who sat through it with his arm in the sling and answered each question with the economy of a man who has given legal testimony before and understands that precision is more useful than elaboration. Then Ren. Coates listened to her with the still attention of a man who had long ago trained himself out of the habit of interrupting witnesses while they were saying the things they needed to say. He did not write quickly. He wrote carefully, as though he understood that the speed of the writing was a statement about the weight of what was being written. When she finished, he closed his notebook. "There'll be a trial," he said, "properly convened at the territorial capital. Given the scope of what's in this ledger, and the son's willingness to testify, and the documents from Milbrook, and the 2 letters found unsent in his study, which my deputies have now secured along with everything else in that house, this will not be a quick proceeding." He looked at Ren steadily. "But it will be a proceeding. That's something I can promise with confidence, and I don't make that promise lightly, because I've worked 11 years across 4 territories on this variety of arrangement, and I have not often had evidence solid enough to make the promise worth making." "The other names," Ren said. "The women in the ledger who aren't in this room, what happens to them?" "We look," Coates said. "Every name, every destination noted in that ledger, every thread that leads somewhere, we follow. I cannot promise we find all of them. I can promise we try, now that there is paper enough to make the trying a marshal's business rather than a rumor that no one with authority wanted to chase." "Della Pruitt," Ren said. "April 1882. She's in the ledger with a destination north and a price. She doesn't come back to a room in this case. She comes back to a headstone if she's lucky, and to someone who says her name in a courtroom as a fact rather than a story about a horse." Coates met her eyes. "Miss Callaway, I will personally ensure that name is spoken in that courtroom." Harlan Doss was taken from Sycamore Bend in irons the following morning. He walked to the marshal's horse with the composure of a man who had not yet fully accepted that the situation was permanent, who still believed, at some level below the surface of his expression, that the right word said to the right person in the right moment could restructure the outcome in his favor. He had spent 15 years being right about that belief. It had not yet finished leaving him. He did not look at Ren as he passed. She had expected to feel something specific in this moment. She had spent weeks imagining it, in the spare hours before sleep, the precise quality of what it would feel like to watch Harlan Doss leave Sycamore Bend in irons. She had expected satisfaction, or relief, or some complicated mixture of those 2 things that she associated with the resolution of something long overdue. What she felt, standing on Verity Hale's porch watching him go, was something quieter than either of those things. Something that arrived slowly, like warmth arriving in a room that has been cold for a long time, gradual and unspectacular and complete. 6 years. She had been 14 years old when Edmund signed her name on a stranger's ledger, and she was 20 now, standing in September morning light in a town that was not Hollow, watching the man who had held that ledger being walked to a horse he had not chosen to ride. She had expected to feel larger than she did. She felt instead exactly her own size, which was, she came to understand slowly, standing there with the frost just leaving the boards under her boots, the precise feeling of a person who has been allowed finally to stop being someone else's number and begin being only themselves. That feeling, it turned out, was not small at all. Whitmore lost his badge within the week. The territorial authorities' review of his conduct, expedited by Coates's personal interest and the testimony of 2 witnesses who had been present at the corral yard branding, resulted in a formal finding of willful negligence and complicity in the concealment of fraud, and he was barred from holding public office in the territory for the remainder of his life, which was a sentence that Ren understood was inadequate in a precise way that no legal proceeding could fully address, because the adequate sentence for 15 years of purchased silence did not exist in any statute she was aware of. She found she could accept that inadequacy without it becoming the thing she carried. There were enough things to carry already, and she had become, over the course of a very instructive 6 weeks, considerably more selective about what she agreed to hold. The trial convened at the territorial capital 3 months later, in December, when the grassland had gone brown and the mornings were hard with frost and the roads that connected Sycamore Bend to the rest of the territory had taken on the particular unreliability of their season. Ren rode the distance with Elias and Opal, 3 days on horseback in the cold, and spent the nights at way stations that were not Verity Hale's boarding house, and were therefore acceptable in precisely the way that things are acceptable, when you have learned not to require comfort as a precondition for proceeding. Beckett had arrived 2 days ahead of them, alone, and had spent both days in the territorial library reading records from 1869 forward with the focused determination of a man who has decided that understanding the full shape of a thing is the price he owes for having lived inside it without knowing what it was. He testified on the 3rd day of the trial and spoke for 4 hours. Ren sat in the gallery and listened to him walk the jury through the architecture of his own childhood, the specific construction of a story that had been built to be believed by a 6-year-old and maintained with sufficient care that the 6-year-old had grown into a 20-year-old without finding a seam in it. He named dates and amounts in the margin note he had read in the lamplight of his father's study, while a woman who had lived in his house for 6 years watched his face do the work of receiving information that changes the shape of everything adjacent to it. His voice broke on the word soul. It broke in the same place it had broken in the firelit street, which told Ren that the breaking was not performance but location, that there was something specific in that word, in that particular moment of understanding that his mother had been transferred like a number in an accounting ledger on a page of his father's private record, that would break in that place every time he came to it, and that he had decided to keep coming to it regardless, because the alternative was to stop speaking the truth in order to protect himself from the feeling of speaking it. And that was a bargain he had watched one man make for 15 years and had decided, standing in a doorway in the dark with a ledger open on a desk, that he was not going to make it himself. He did not stop when it broke. He kept going. Ren testified on the 4th day. She had thought about what she would say for 3 months, not rehearsed exactly. She did not have the temperament for rehearsal, which required a fixed version of a thing to practice toward, and she had learned over 6 years that fixed versions of things were a luxury available only to people whose situations remained stable enough to practice toward them. She had thought about the shape of it. The essential thing she wanted the 12 men in the jury box to understand, not the details of the ledger, which Coates and Beckett had laid out with thoroughness, not the specifics of the branding morning, which Opal had described with a cook's precision for relevant detail, but the underlying structure of what Doss had built and why it had worked as long as it had. She stood before the jury with the same upright stillness she had maintained in the corral yard 3 months before, spine straight, voice even, and she told them, "He built a system," she said, in which a woman's entire life could be converted into a number that was always slightly higher than the number she could reach. The debt was designed not to be paid. It was designed to be renewed. Each year it grew because he added to it each year, and each addition was calculated to ensure that the distance between what was owed and what was earnable stayed constant. It never got closer. He made sure of that. She paused and looked at the 12 faces in the jury box. "I want you to understand what it is to live inside a number that won't come down. You begin to believe the number is real. You begin to believe that your labor, your time, your body, your years are genuinely worth what the number says they're worth to the man holding the ledger. That's what the system is designed to produce. Not a woman who is chained. A woman who has been convinced the chain is mathematics." She told them about Della. Not the official record version which Coates had entered as evidence, but the lived version. The woman who had taught her to fold pie dough and to fold her own expression. The laugh deployed like a well-timed tool in a kitchen doorway at the precise moment when someone standing nearby needed to be reminded that laughter was still a thing available to people in their situation. The morning Odell Grant had ridden in alone, and the story he had delivered in the flat voice of a man reciting something he did not believe. The supper she had served that evening without a word. I have asked myself, every day since I left that ranch, what the correct thing to do that evening would have been. Speaking would not have saved her. I know that. But speaking would have been a true thing, and I chose a false silence instead, because the arithmetic of my own survival said silence was cheaper. That arithmetic was Harlan Doss's greatest accomplishment. He had made the cost of truth higher than the cost of silence in every room he controlled. and he had done it so completely and over such a long time that I made his calculation for him without his needing to be present. She looked at the jury. That is what this trial is about. Not the ledger, exactly. Not the individual transactions, though those are crimes and should be addressed as crimes. It is about a man who spent 15 years making the truth more expensive than the lie in every room he occupied, and who relied on the rest of us making his calculations for him in his absence. I am telling you now that I will not make those calculations anymore. I am asking you to refuse to make them either. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on every count before them: fraud, forced servitude, the unlawful transfer of persons under fraudulent contractual pretense, and on the strength of testimony from 2 former ranch hands who had come forward in the 3rd week of the trial, when the proceedings had drawn enough public attention that the cost of silence had shifted for them as it had shifted for others, a charge of manslaughter in the death of Della Pruitt, whose transfer north in April 1882 had been recovered in its full details from the records of a ranch operation 2 territories over that had not been careful enough about its own paperwork. Della had not survived the year of her transfer. The record was plain about that. In its impersonal and devastating way, Ren did not attend the sentencing. She had said, in that courtroom, everything she needed to say, and she understood that watching Das receive his sentence would not add to what had already been done, and might cost her something she preferred to keep. She read Coates's letter on the porch of Verity Hale's boarding house 3 days after returning to Sycamore Bend in the December morning light, with frost on the porch rail and a cup of coffee going cold in her other hand. She read it once. Then she folded it carefully and held it for a moment, the way you hold something whose weight you want to feel one last time before you put it away. Then she went inside and put it in the drawer where she kept the chain. She had not worn the chain since the morning she had walked out of Doss Hollow. She had not needed to. But she kept it because some things deserved to be kept rather than discarded, and because the weight of it in her hand when she opened the drawer was a reminder not of what she had endured but of the specific decision she had made inside the enduring, the choice to carry something rather than have something forced onto her skin. The letter stayed next to the chain, 2 objects that had served their purpose, neither discarded. She opened the office in January. The money came from the sale of Doss Hollow's confiscated cattle, directed by the territorial court's restitution order to the establishment of a fund for the women named in the ledger and those who came after them. The notary downstairs drafted the legal papers. Verity Hale extended the use of the 2nd floor of the boarding house for as long as it was needed on terms that Ren wrote out herself and Verity signed without modifying a single word. Opal, who had taught herself figures with the same patient stubbornness she had brought to every other practical skill in her life, kept the books from the first day and did not ask for help with the work until the 3rd month, and by then did not need it. The shingle outside read, "Help for women under contract. Sycamore Bend." Beckett Doss took work at the notary's office downstairs. He had testified for 4 hours in a courtroom against his own father, and had come out the other side still standing, though the standing required a kind of daily recommitment that he did not discuss with anyone except occasionally Ren, who received it without offering comfort too quickly, which was the kind of reception he had needed and had not known to ask for. He visited the grave of Adeline Doss, found at last in a county 2 territories east under the name she had been transferred under, every month without exception, and never complained about the distance, because the distance was not the point. The distance was simply what paying the debt required, and he had decided, standing in a doorway in the dark with a ledger pushed across a desk toward him, that he was not the kind of man who balked at what the debt required. 2 of the 7 women were found in the first 2 months. The first was living 3 counties north under a name she had taken for survival, and had been using long enough that answering to her original name required a moment of deliberate translation, a conscious reaching back through the years to a self she had not been permitted to remain. She wept for a long time when Coates found her and explained that the debt recorded against her name had been declared void by a federal court, and that the man who had recorded it was behind territorial bars, and that she was, in the precise legal language of the ruling, free of any claim arising from the fraudulent instrument in question, and all instruments derivative of it. She came to the office in Sycamore Bend and sat across from Ren at the desk, and Ren told her in the plainest words she had the same thing she would tell every woman who came through that door afterward. "You are not a number. You were never a number. The ledger is evidence now. Your name in it is a record of a crime committed against you, not a record of a debt you owed. You may take whatever time you need in this room before you decide what comes next. There is no hurry. The door bolts from the inside." The 2nd woman was found in a mining town hotel kitchen 6 weeks later, working under her own name because she had decided, after some years, that taking a different name meant accepting that her original one was something to be hidden, and she had not wanted to concede that. She was 31 and had built something approximating a life in the mining town, and she came to Sycamore Bend not to start over but to stand in the office and see with her own eyes that the document which had once defined her existence had been reduced to an exhibit in a courthouse file, which was a very different thing from a threat. She stayed 2 days. She returned to the mining town. She wrote to the office 3 times in the following year, and Ren answered each letter personally. The third was found 4 months later, older, married under a new name to a man who had known her only as she was when he met her, which was to say as a complete person with a history she had not yet shared with him. When she shared it, he drove the 70 miles to Sycamore Bend with her and sat beside her in the office across from Ren and held her hand and said almost nothing, which was exactly the right amount to say. And Ren noted it and thought that some men learned correctly without being taught directly, and that this was a rarer thing than it should have been, and not nothing when you found it. 2 names in the ledger were never found. Constance Farrow and the woman listed only as the widow Marsh, whose given name appeared nowhere in Doss's records and whose absence from every search codes conducted in the following 18 months settled eventually into the particular quality of open question that cannot be closed without lying about it. Ren had their names written on a card and pinned it above her desk. Not as failure. As a debt of attention she intended to keep paying for as long as the office stood and as long as she stood with it. Odell Grant took work at Aldrich's store, stocking shelves with the methodical care of a man who has decided that usefulness in a small form is the right scale at which to rebuild a credibility he had spent too many years spending down. He tipped his hat to Ren when they passed on the street, and she returned the nod, and they did not have another conversation about the corral yard. Because the conversation they had already had on the road at dusk had said what needed saying, and adding to it would only have diluted it. Whitfield Morrow, who had sat on a fence rail in the dark, half a mile from Doss Hollow, and lifted 2 fingers from the rail as they passed, took a permanent position at the office writing correspondence and carrying messages between Sycamore Bend and the surrounding territory whenever word came of another woman who needed what the office could provide. He was 18 by the time the office opened and had the particular usefulness of a young person who has done one genuinely difficult thing well and is now committed to the doing of difficult things as a general practice rather than an exception. The locket was opened in the 3rd week of January by a watchmaker on the north end of Sycamore Bend's single street, a slight, precise man who worked the rusted hinge with tools fine enough to move it without breaking it, in under 10 minutes on a Tuesday morning, with winter light coming through his window at a flat, unhelpful angle. Inside the locket was a photograph, small and faded to the point where only the outline of a face remained, the specific oval of a woman's jaw and the dark suggestion of hair, nothing clear enough to identify, nothing lost enough to be meaningless. On the back of the photograph, in handwriting that was gentle in the specific way of someone who had considered each word before committing it to a surface that would outlast the moment of its writing. For whoever finds this, remember I was here, no name, no date, no other information. Ren had the locket framed, glass over it so that both the photograph and the inscription were visible, and she hung it above the office door, low enough that anyone passing through would see it at eye level before they saw anything else in the room. She explained it to Elias the afternoon she hung it, standing back to check the level of the frame against the door. It seemed wrong, she said, to build a place meant to help women be remembered, and not have something in it that proves someone already understood how much that mattered before either of us thought to do anything about it. Elias looked at the frame. His arm was out of the sling by then, the shoulder stiff in cold weather in a way that would probably stay with him, the specific permanent tax that certain injuries levy on the body for the remainder of its use. "Do you know who it belonged to?" he asked. "No. One of the 7, possibly. Or someone before the 7 that we don't have a record for. There's no way to know." She looked at the photograph through the glass. The outline of a jaw, the suggestion of hair. She knew someone might find it. She knew that much. She put it where it could be found, and she wrote something on the back that would matter to whoever found it, even not knowing who that would be or when. "And here you are," Elias said. "Here we are," she said. He put his good arm around her shoulders, careful of the framing wire, and she let herself lean into it, just slightly, the way she had been practicing, in the months since the corral yard, the specific skill of allowing support that was offered freely, which turned out to require more deliberate practice than shooting, and to matter more in the long run. She had commissioned Della's headstone in the 1st week of December, before the ground froze and made the stonecutter's work impossible until spring. She paid him from her own first month's wages at the office rather than from the restitution fund, because she had decided that this particular debt was personal and did not belong to any court settlement, any more than grief belongs to the proceeding that names its cause. The stone read, "Della Pruitt. She taught me to fold the truth inside my own face, remember." She rode the 2 hours to the small cemetery on the edge of what had been Doss Hollow, which had been bought at territorial auction by a family from the east who did not yet know its history, and would learn it eventually and make of that learning what they would. The morning she rode out was clear and cold, the grassland brown and flat under a sky the color of the inside of a tin cup, and she stood beside the stone for a long time in the particular silence of a place where the wind moves through the grass and nothing else does. She did not speak aloud. She was not someone who spoke aloud to graves, believing the person she wanted to speak to was not located in the ground, but rather in the specific absence that her death had made in every room Ren had occupied since. The gap in the air where Della's voice should have been. The shape of a laugh deployed like a well-timed tool in a kitchen doorway at the exact moment when it was most needed. The absence of someone who had taught her, without knowing she was teaching, that the truth could be held inside the body without the body being broken by holding it. She rode back to Sycamore Bend in the early afternoon and arrived before the light changed. The first woman through the door who mattered most came on the morning of the office's opening day, before the ink on the shingle outside had fully cured in the January cold. She was road-worn in the particular way of someone who has been traveling for longer than they expected when they started, and her wrists were chafed from a leather strap much like the one Ren still kept folded in the drawer next to the chain. She stood in the doorway with the particular posture of someone who has spent a long time learning to take up as little space as possible and is not yet certain she has permission to change that habit. Ren was at the desk. She looked up. The woman said, "Please help me." 2 words, the weight of everything behind them. Ren rose from the desk without speaking. She crossed the room. She stood at the woman's eye level, because she had learned in 6 years at Doss Hollow and 6 weeks in Sycamore Bend the difference between standing over someone and standing with them, and took both her wrists gently in her own hands, and began, without hesitation and without asking permission, to work the strap loose. "You're not alone anymore," Ren said. "Let's get you free." Outside, on the porch step in the pale winter light, Elias Crow sat with a clean gun across his knees and the particular quality of stillness that belongs to a man who has made his peace with waiting, who has understood that the most useful thing he can offer is not action but presence, not the solving of a problem but the willingness to remain near it for as long as it takes someone else to do the solving they are entirely capable of doing themselves. He heard her voice through the wall. He looked up once, briefly, at the window. Then he looked back at the road that ran through Sycamore Bend and out the other end toward the rest of the territory, and at the shingle above the door, that said what it said in plain letters for anyone passing to read. He had come to a corral yard in September because he had been 3 days late once and had built his entire subsequent life around the intention of not being 3 days late again. He had not known, riding through that tree line at Doss Hollow on a September morning, that the arithmetic he had been carrying since Nora's death was about to be balanced by something other than guilt. He had not known that such a balancing was possible, had not been looking for it, would not have known what to call it if he had encountered it. He knew what to call it now. He sat in the January light and listened to the sound of Ren Callaway doing for someone else exactly what a stranger's quiet, unhurried arrival had once done for her, and he found that the sound of it was sufficient, more than sufficient. It was the sound of a morning that belonged to someone who had decided what to do with mornings, and that being near that sound, able to hear it through the wall of a building where a shingle outside offered something plain and true to anyone who came looking for it, was the best use of a January day in Wyoming that he could imagine. The road was empty in both directions, not for long. It was never empty for long anymore, not since the shingle went up, not since word had begun moving through the territory the way word moves when it carries something people have been waiting to hear, from one person to another across kitchen tables and dry goods store counters and fence lines, and the long stretches of road between ranches where the grass bends in the wind and the sky holds more weather than you can track from one horizon. The chain was in the drawer, the letter was beside it, the locket hung above the door in its frame of winter light. And in the room above the notary's office on Sycamore Bend's one real street, a woman who had been 14 when someone else signed her name on a ledger was 20 now and sitting across from another woman whose name had been signed the same way, and telling her, in the plainest words available, the same things she intended to keep telling every woman who walked through that door for as long as the door stood open and the shingle held its promise in the cold Wyoming air. You are not a number, you were never a number, and the door bolts from the inside.